Well, I think the most striking thing about George Osborne's speech was that this is the first conference that the Tories have had since they won a majority, and yet George Osborne devoted a large chunk of it to the need to win over Labour voters. He talked about winning over those working people who still voted in their millions for Labour at the last election. I think we saw some ideas of how he's going to do that, and I thought the new announcement in the speech was this devolution revolution, which allows local councils in England to keep all of business rates. What I think is quite significant about that is that the Treasury traditionally has been the great centralising department, and you've now got a Chancellor who is championing devolution, and I think it's because he sees it as a way to push through centre-right ideas. He hopes that these local councils will cut business rates in an attempt to generate more revenue, and that will shift the political debate in Britain.
Well, I thought George Osborne's speech was a very sober speech about the challenges that the Conservatives still faced in terms of winning back Labour voters, for instance, who still hadn't backed the Conservatives in May. I thought it was quite a big vision speech as well. It obviously included his National Infrastructure Commission, which was trailed overnight, that has Lord Adonis as its new crossbench peer chair, and it included a big reform, which is the end of local government grant and councils being able to keep their rates, and the abolition of the uniform business rate so councils can set their business rates as well.
Well, I think that George Osborne's problem at the moment is that he is the front runner. So I actually thought this was quite a toned down speech in terms of leadership. There was no great long credo section. He didn't try and do that much on his own personal backstory or anything like that. But instead, I think you saw him doing kind of chunky, big things. And I think that is what his pitch to the Tory party ultimately will be. That he is the guy who's got the big vision and who takes the big decisions.
Well, I think this has been a good speech for his leadership chances in that it went down well in the hall. It was a sort of sober assessment of where the Conservatives need to go next. But the local business rate reform is huge, and it's hugely detailed and complex. And actually, it won't be so much the speech that impacts his leadership chances as whether those reforms will work and won't lead to a rebellion in Tory local government, or whether Tory local government will actually really like being given this freedom.
Well, I thought it was slightly less tub-thumping, perhaps, than some of them. It didn't have the kind of the crowd-pleasing showstopper of the inheritance tax cut. But I also thought it was quite a serious speech. You know, this is ultimately, a speech about local government finance. It is not something that generally gets people's hearts racing. But I thought it was all about that he is a guy who does big things. I thought that was the message he wanted to get across.
Well, Osborne's refrain was, we are the builders, we're the party who are going to do things, who are going to make big decisions, such as on infrastructure, and also to free up local government to make its own decisions, to compete, and actually to give it the responsibility for growth in its area, rather than making central government responsible. Now, obviously, this is also convenient because there's a spending review coming up where local government grant was going to be cut hugely anyway. So it's one way of devolving some of the pain to local government as well, but obviously Osborne didn't acknowledge that. He did talk a little bit about Labour in his speech, about Labour refusing to make decisions, to be on the side of the few rather than the many, but actually most of his speech really was about his legacy project, about the Northern Powerhouse, about what he wants to do to make the case for him being Prime Minister, having been a successful Chancellor. Well, the hall at Conservative Conference is quite odd. It's huge, and a lot of the atmosphere just gets sucked away by its size. And the speeches that I've heard all of the speeches at this conference so far, none of them have really taken the roof off, partly because the roof is so far away from the delegates. But it was well received. I saw lots of knots of councillors afterwards standing around trying to work out what this means for their local area. And I think that there'll be a lot of debate about whether this works for rural areas, for poorer areas. But it was certainly a speech that really engaged people's interest. And everyone turned up to see him, not just because he's the Chancellor, but because he's the man of the moment in terms of the leadership contest.